Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vitorian, and this is the 25th hour, helping you remember everything beyond the 24/7 news cycle. Now, in this week's news, for the week of April 18th to the 24th, 2021, walk-in appointments are now accepted throughout the city and state. Cuomo continues to refuse answering reporters' questions about his scandals. Biden held a climate change summit and plans his first foreign trips. Congress passes measures endorsing Washington, D.C. as the 51st state and condemning anti-Asian hate crimes. The Supreme Court issues a series of decisions and dismissals, and Derek Chauvin has been convicted in George Floyd's death. Now, onto the show. Things may have changed by the time you hear this, starting with the Blasio. Anyone 50 and older in New York City can walk into a handful of pharmacies around the 5 boroughs to get vaccinated, announced de Blasio. This was before the mayor announced that all throughout the city, walk-in appointments would welcome anyone 16 and up for Pfizer appointments and 18 and up for Moderna appointments. Even the American Museum of Natural History is becoming a vaccination site, with the iconic whale sporting a giant Band-Aid. City health officials are saying that almost 25% of the entire city got sick with COVID at the beginning of the pandemic, with minority communities taking the brunt of the outbreak. The mayor also said this week that he might lift the outdoor mask requirement if vaccine rates in the city continue to go up.
Let's start with the assumption that we're going to hold the line through June. June's the date that we've set to hit our vaccination goal. June is, one of those times in the year that we're used to, sort of a reset moment every year. As we get to the end of school, beginning of summer and all, we want to hold the line through June. So we'll keep, the masks on, and we'll do all the things we need to do. After that, we'll be able to reassess. And I think you're right that one of the things we can say to people is, if you want to get rid of the masks, if you want to get rid of the social distancing, if you want to get rid of the restrictions, go get vaccinated. And we're going to have to keep masks and restrictions in place until we're 100% sure we're out of the woods. And the best way to know we're out of the woods is to see those vaccination numbers go up and up and up.
The city is also undertaking a $30 million tourism campaign funded by federal relief money from the American Rescue Plan, aiming to get visitors back into the Red Apple and revive the local economy. Yang got the top spot at another poll this week, this time conducted for New York 1, clinching the top spot at 22%, followed by Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams at 13%, then Stringer at 11%, and Wiley at 7%. A Siena College poll also has Yang at the top with 24% of registered Democrats over 50 years old choosing him as their top option, while Adams and Stringer were tied at 13%, followed by Citigroup executive Ray McGuire at 9%. Meanwhile, Stringer got the endorsement of the city's teachers union, the UFT. Andrew Yang also received the endorsement of a former mayoral candidate who was trying to take up the progressive lane, Councilman Carlos Menchaca, with Yang trying to show that progressives can vote for him instead of candidates publicly staking the progressive position like Dianne Morales. Eric Adams announced endorsements from 4 Queens politicos, trying to counteract Ray McGuire's endorsement from Queens Democratic Party boss and Congressman Gregory Meeks. The city reported that Eric Adams received about $323,000 from 2015 to 2019 from lobbyists and developers looking to get their own projects approved, with the donation sent to either Adams' One Brooklyn Fund or his political campaign. Maya Wiley, who used to be de Blasio's counsel, has apparently had a closer link to approving donors to the mayor's fund to advance New York City, which, along with de Blasio's nonprofit campaign for One New York, was hit with conflict of interest ethical concerns. Maya Wiley wants to end the Gifted and Talented program entirely, saying it's racially discriminatory, although her children took advantage of the program for their schooling. Yang proposed bringing grocery stores to communities called food swamps, those that have a ton of fast food options but not fresh groceries. Yang apparently put his foot in his mouth again at an LGBTQ forum, where he said that because both of his campaign managers are gay, he had a lot of familiarity with the gay community, leading advocates to call Yang out of touch. Citigroup executive Ray McGuire, meanwhile, will be paid a total of $5 million from the bank between 2022 to 2025, even if he wins the mayoral race. Former HUD Secretary Sean Donovan will get his $1.5 million in public matching funds after all, after the Campaign Finance Board held up the money to look into a political action committee that Donovan's father pumped $2 million into supporting his son's mayoral efforts. Comptroller candidate Brad Lander decided to start a website this week, publicly accusing fellow candidate Council Speaker Corey Johnson from holding back Lander's bills in the council, along with other bills. The move reportedly hadn't made Lander's allies happy, however, as Johnson moved along the same progressive circles. Johnson was endorsed by the 1199 SEIU labor union this week as well, probably not helping Lander's case. It also doesn't help that Lander was caught speeding in school zones 8 times in the past 5 years. I see someone who champions laws punishing reckless drivers by having the city tow their cars. After the state legislature increased school funding in the latest budget to comply with a court order to equitably fund the state's schools, the city is receiving more money for about 1,200 schools, totaling about $600 million a year, spending more for 700,000 students. The lawyer the Manhattan DA's office is looking for running off of this client's money, Michael Kosoff, won't have a law firm to come back to, even if he doesn't land in jail right away. The attorneys in Kosoff PLLC resigned and the firm is imploding. The Daily News reported that the Department of Corrections hasn't been putting its officers through suicide prevention and other class recertifications, a week after it was reported that officers were also vaccinating at the lowest rate of other public employees. Gun violence increased in New York City, continuing an upward trend for this year by 250% compared to last year. Between April 12th and 18th, 29 people were shot in 28 shootings. The number of homicides decreased, however, by 60% from 10 to 4 killings from last year. De Blasio unveiled a Safe Summer NYC plan aimed at tackling gun violence, putting more police officers in high-crime areas, and building up a program that offers gang members 2,000 summer jobs, along with increasing gun buyback programs and reactivating Operation Ceasefire, allowing community members to open lines of communication with gang members.
We're going to make sure that the officers are where we need them to be, and we'll make adjustments.
The NYPD is creating a civilian advisory panel on hate crimes to help the department navigate where to fight back against hate crimes. Police Commissioner Dermache announced the creation of the NYPD Hate Crime Review Panel at a briefing on Monday. The panel has 5 volunteer members, including the Jewish Museum's Devra Halberstam and the president of the America-China Public Affairs Institute, Fred Tang. Following other DAs asking judges to vacate or dismiss cases of dealing with prostitution and unlicensed massages, Manhattan DA Cy Vance asked to dismiss almost 6,000 cases. Once Cuomo signed the repeal of a walking while trans law, which targeted trans prostitutes, the various district attorneys around the 5 boroughs took action to formalize the repeal in the courts. 6 people were arrested at Columbus Circle this week after the USS Maine National Monument was vandalized with anti-police graffiti at Central Park, with protesters fighting with police. A city transit agency report showing that the workforce shrunk by 9%, down from 30,000 personnel at the start of 2019. The MTA said that more than 4,000 workers left the payroll, with most working in the buses and subways, hitting the transportation system in the city hard. After the MTA revealed survey results last week showing subway riders were anxious about crime, the police department hit back at the MTA for apparent, quote, fear-mongering. The city planning department said that the rezoning of the Gowanus neighborhood in Brooklyn can move forward after a group of residents tried holding it up in court, but was put back on the city's agenda after Judge Catherine Levine indicated she would approve the rezoning and lifted the temporary restraining order against the city. Separately, construction started for a pipeline in Brownsville, Brooklyn by National Grid, despite the objections of de Blasio neighborhood residents and environmental activists. The mayor encouraged state officials to cancel a plan to develop an Astoria, Queens power plant into a natural gas plant built by the energy company NRG, which in turn says it plans to turn the plant into a hydrogen-producing facility as per state guidelines. JFK Airport will also see the renovation of its busiest airport terminal delayed and even diminished after the Port Authority agreed to cut $2.3 billion from the budget. Contracts are being renegotiated after the pandemic hit the airline industry hard and necessitated cutbacks. New York Focus reported this week that 250,000 city employees are going to have their health insurance changed to privately managed Medicare Advantage plans by July 1st, an effort by the city to save taxpayers $600 million in health insurance costs, but potentially giving older New York City workers less health care options. Over at the City Council, Queens Councilman Robert Holden is calling for an investigation into former Education Chancellor Richard Carranza's new job working at ICL Learning, an e-learning company that earned millions of dollars through contracts with the city while Carranza was chancellor, saying that the time frame was too short between when Carranza resigned as chancellor and getting hired. Holden sent a letter to Mark Lesko, the acting U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, to investigate Carranza. Carranza was also just recently fined $1,100 by the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board for taking his wife on an official Department of Education outing to see the Broadway show Hamilton. Since Carranza's wife wasn't a DOE employee, she shouldn't have gotten one of the $10 discounted tickets. After a robotic dog controlled by the NYPD was seen exiting a public housing project last week and gave people nightmares, Councilman Ben Kalos and Speaker Corey Johnson subpoenaed the department for any contracts it may have with Boston Dynamics, the company that made the robot dog. The dog apparently starts at $74,000, and council members have privacy concerns with the use of robots. South Brooklyn Councilman Chaim Deutsch pled guilty this week to tax fraud after a federal investigation revealed Deutsch took in more than $85,000 in outside income from his real estate management company. The crime he pled guilty to has a punishment of up to a year in jail plus a fine. Deutsch is term limited and has so far refused to resign despite calls from Speaker Johnson for him to do so. The other South Brooklyn councilman, Mark Traeger, got his bill approved this week to ban all vehicles on the boardwalk border in Coney Island and Brighton Beach in an attempt to preserve the historic landmark. Over at the Cuomo administration, New Yorkers over the age of 60 can now walk into any mass vaccination center without an appointment to get their shot, further expediting New York's vaccination rate, the governor announced. Now anyone over 16 and 18 can go get their shots. Following the pause on Johnson & Johnson vaccines, state corrections staff have paused vaccinating the state's prisoners, even in the face of a court order requiring the state to inoculate its prison population. The statewide eviction moratorium put in place through the governor is set to expire on May 1st, with the state relaunching a rent relief program with $2.4 billion in assistance funds with the help of the federal government. Cuomo's favorability ratings keep tanking, with the latest Siena College poll showing that more than half of New Yorkers view him unfavorably at 52%, while 40% view him favorably. Cuomo's favorability was at 77% last year. Attorney General Letitia James launched a new investigation looking into Cuomo's using state resources for his COVID leadership book, namely having state workers edit and draft portions of the book. The governor's office refuses to show how much Cuomo earned from the sales of the book, with his office saying the amount will be revealed in his tax returns. It was revealed through reporting that Cuomo hired at least 4 law firms to do work for him, defending him from investigations into his sexual assault and nursing home scandals, but there aren't any details into the agreements between the firms and the governor. Cuomo refused to say whether he would step down if it was found by Letitia James's office that he violated the law through his sexual harassment scandals.
What I've said there a number of times, Michael, is let the review proceed, and then there'll be a lot to talk about in the review. And there's a lot that I want to talk about in the review. You know, there's been one side of the story, and then the Attorney General, I referred to doing pick people to do an independent review. That's the referral on this matter. And then the legislature started a review. So there will be a lot to talk about on this situation.
State Republican Party Chairman Lick Langworthy said that he hopes to have a singular Republican challenger against Cuomo by the end of the year. With Cuomo's recent scandals, Republicans are coming out of the woodworks to challenge him. Democratic Ulster County Executive Pat Ryan said he is launching a political action committee called Serve New York, aiming to bring people with experience in service-oriented jobs like veterans and healthcare workers to run for office, having already raised $250,000. According to a new state audit released by State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli, Cuomo's attempts to stop fare evasion and the MTA subway have failed despite the various things Cuomo's tried. From 2017 to 2020, fare evasion has actually increased in the MTA, totaling $300 million. Following the legalization of marijuana in New York, the statutory scheme requires that a cannabis control board be created to handle the influx of license applications for those seeking to start new marijuana businesses. The city reported that the board will have its 5 members, most being appointed by Cuomo, will be up and running in June. A new Siena College poll found that while New Yorkers are concerned about climate change, it's air and water pollution that is on the top of their minds the most. The governor, who was present for an event that saw the officials start to developing a close to $440 million project looking to change the direction of treated sewage from a plant in East Rockaway, as well as restore the Western Bays and Reynolds Channel. The more interesting part politically is that other elected officials also took part in the event that have previously called on Cuomo to resign, including Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins, who didn't say anything on the day of the event. Albany police took down tents inhabited by protesters that were put up in front of one of the police stations. The encampments were set up following a heavy police presence to demonstrations celebrating Derek Chauvin's conviction for killing George Floyd. Albany police then took down the tents and arrested some more protesters after Police Chief Eric Hawkins declared the setup as an unlawful occupation, with demonstrators vowing not to let up the confrontations with police. Over at the state legislature, 2 bills in the legislature aim to make sexual harassment a crime, something that can potentially send people to jail other than fine them or get workers fired. If the bills become law, New York would be the first state in the union to criminalize sexual harassment and come on the heels of Cuomo's sexual assault accusations. A bill that would legalize a single-payer healthcare system in the state of New York has passed the Assembly Health Committee, a major move long sought by Health Committee Chair Richard Gottfried. Cuomo hasn't been really supportive of a single-payer system in the state before, saying the issue is better left to the federal government. State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins said this week that there is a, quote, appetite for ethics reform following Governor Cuomo's multiple scandals. Stewart-Cousins also made clear this week that she's not planning a run for governor, as Democrats are looking for anyone that can possibly replace Cuomo before next year's gubernatorial election. Stewart-Cousins also asked the federal government to take up the issue of marijuana still being illegal on the federal level, since banks are going to have a hard time taking on businesses selling marijuana in about a year and a half. Barring any last-second complications, as long as the Assembly passes changes to the Senate's language in their bill, the state legislature will pass the New York HEROES Act aimed at shoring up workplace protections, taking the pandemic into account. The bill finds businesses that don't have new policies protecting workers from airborne diseases, directs the Department of Labor to pass their own guidelines for businesses to follow, including having businesses provide masks and other PPE, and allow workers to sue businesses for not complying with regulations, with the last part a major sticking point for business groups like the National Federation of Independent Business, the Business Council, and more. At an Assembly impeachment meeting held for the first time in a while, looking into whether Governor Cuomo should be impeached for his scandals, Judiciary Committee Chair Charles Levine said that 200 tips came into their office revolving around Cuomo's misconduct a week after reporting revealed 100 calls came in into the hotline set up about the same thing. The Assembly finally passed a bill that was already passed in the Senate dealing with giving parolees voting rights, heading to Cuomo's desk. Cuomo had signed an executive order earlier on the matter in 2018. Over in the state judiciary, Chief Judge Janet DeFiore announced this week that every judge and all court staff are required to come back to the office starting May 24th, but that doesn't mean all court proceedings are going to happen in person either. The union representing court workers, the Civil Service Employees Association, was one of the unions questioning the decision to bring workers back into courts, worried that the return was happening too fast. Former Suffolk County, Long Island District Attorney Tom Spoda was already convicted of obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and more for corruption and subsequent cover-ups of how the police department treated criminal suspects, and can now potentially face an increased sentence if prosecutors have anything to say about it. Federal Eastern District prosecutors asked the judge to sentence Spoda to 8 years in prison, which is above the suggested federal sentencing guidelines for his crimes. The NYPD settled an illegal case about the force's use of an alert noise from a device atop police cruisers after protesters sued the city for the practice, alleging it causes migraines and dizziness. The police agreed to stop using the long-range acoustic devices, or LRADs, and the city is paying out $98,000 to 5 plaintiffs and $650,000 in legal fees. The city is also settling a police brutality case for $750,000 in which police kept a pregnant woman in handcuffs while she was in labor and keeping her cuffed after she gave birth. The officers kept her cuffed because they said they were afraid of a reprimand from their superiors. The 22-year-old woman was arrested because of a family dispute. The NYCLU sued the Buffalo Police Department, claiming it didn't divulge police disciplinary records despite the repeal of a law called 50A, which doesn't shield those types of records anymore. A recent trial court case also brought New York in line with federal law in saying police records are considered Brady material, in that prosecutors have to divulge those records to defense attorneys if the prosecutors want the officer in question to testify. White Plains District Judge Vincent Burchetti sentenced a former lawyer, Gustavo Villa, to over 4 years in prison for stealing his former friend John Ferreira's 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund money, totaling about $1 million. Judge Burchetti also ordered that Villa repay Ferreira, whom Villa only paid $100,000 to, claiming the fund ran out of money. Former lawyer Stephen Donziger, who used to represent Ecuadorian farmers in a lawsuit against Chevron and won, whom only afterwards was disbarred from practicing in New York since Chevron sued Donziger right back in U.S. courts, publicly chastised Southern District Judge Loretta Preska's decision, shooting down Donziger's request to televise his contempt trial. Judge Preska said the federal rules of civil procedure do not allow broadcasting criminal trials. Donziger was held in contempt for breaking his house arrest after losing in U.S. courts against Chevron. Federal Southern District Judge Paul Engelmayer became the second judge ever to allow a breach of contract claim to move forward by students against the university for remote learning. Pace University students are suing the school, saying remote learning isn't the same as in-person learning, and they're not getting the same value they signed up for by learning through their computers and deserve their money back. New York City is suing ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, and BP in New York Supreme Court for allegedly violating consumer protection laws when the oil companies marketed themselves as leaders in combating climate change, that some of their fuel products were clean and had less impact on the environment. An earlier lawsuit against numerous oil companies was dismissed in the federal Supreme Court, reasoning that international issues such as climate change are better fought within the realm of federal statutes and treaties and not in municipalities like New York City. This lawsuit is different as the city isn't asking the companies to pay for programs fighting climate change. Over at the Biden administration, Biden celebrated this week as Americans received 200 million doses before Biden's first 100 days were up, a major achievement the president was gunning for.
When tomorrow's vaccine and vaccination numbers come out, we will show that today we did it. Today we hit 200 million shots and the 92nd day in office. 200 million shots in 100 days, in under 100 days, actually. It's an incredible achievement for the nation, and here's the context. You know, at the pace we're moving when I took office, it would have taken us more than 220 days, almost 7 months, 7.5 months to reach 200 million shots. Instead of marking this milestone in April, we would not have seen it until early September at the earliest. Some experts say that the rapid vaccination effort has already saved tens of thousands of American lives. We'll never know exactly, but we know it saved lives.
The CDC said at the start of the week that half of all U.S. adults have received at least one dose of the various COVID vaccines out on the market, although the U.S. is still falling behind the likes of Israel and the U.K. Additionally, every state in the U.S. has met Biden's deadline of having all adults over the age of 16 be eligible for a COVID vaccine, a goal set out by the president in his first 100 days. Dr. Anthony Fauci indicated that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine won't be paused for much longer as public health officials ascertain whether there are any blood clotting concerns in the general populace. You may recall 6 women had blood clotting issues from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, leading to its pause. The CDC's advisory panel overseeing the vaccine also said that it found 2 more deaths that may be linked to the vaccine, with 4 people currently hospitalized and 5 others discharged. A recommendation may be released by the end of this week on pausing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine but slapping a warning label on it. The Government Accountability Office released a report concluding that missions to bring Americans back home at the start of the COVID outbreak created health and safety risks, such as an effort to get Americans off a cruise ship in Japan in February. The Biden administration is providing $150 million to walk-in clinics outside of the federal government's health center program, assisting clinics serving underserved low-income communities. The U.S. issued travel warnings to encompass 80% of the world, attempting to still stem travel in the midst of the pandemic. The FDA, after an investigation into the Emergent Biosolutions plant in Maryland that messed up millions of Johnson & Johnson vaccines, found that there were a total of 9 violations that went further than the original ingredient mix-up that caused the cancellation of the huge vaccine order. For example, the building's design was a problem, and the employees were improperly trained, according to the 12-page report. President Biden announced in the middle of the week that small businesses that gave their workers paid time off for vaccinations can get additional tax credits for doing so at $511 a day per worker. The next mission for the Biden administration's vaccine effort is to try and reach vaccine-reluctant people who are hesitant in getting their shots, with the administration focusing on working with community groups and removing financial barriers to getting people vaccinated. The CDC released a new study over the week that looked at pregnancy risks in conjunction with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, finding no evidence that the vaccines pose any serious risks and stressing that there is more danger in contracting COVID while pregnant. The CDC also said that it's revising its outdoor mask guidance in light of new information about the pandemic, as public health officials from outside the agency said restrictions should be eased up for low-risk activities taking place outside. The president is also considering a new rule limiting the amount of nicotine in cigarettes so that they're less addictive. Around the same time, the administration has to consider the question of whether to ban menthol cigarettes. Unemployment claims fell to another pandemic low of 547,000 last week, down from 586,000 as the economy picks up. Biden took meetings this week from Republicans and Democrats, saying he's open to compromise, which includes a proposal to reduce the corporate tax rate scheme from 28 to 25% in his infrastructure proposal. The tax rate for corporations before Trump was 35%, and he passed the tax bill lowering it to 21%. It's not going to stop Republicans like Senator John Cornyn to push the $800 billion counterproposal they offered last week, falling far short of the president's nearly $2.5 trillion initiative. We later talk about the Republicans' new plan that is even lower than the $800 billion pitch deck they gave last week. One of the new initiatives that Biden is getting ready to announce at his April 28th address to Congress is his American Families Plan, a measure that is the second part of Biden's infrastructure agenda, which reportedly costs at least $1 trillion on its own. Biden is reportedly pitching tax increases on the wealthy to pay for childcare, education, and paid family leave, including increasing the capital gains tax for those making more than $1 million annually to 39.6%. Tim Scott, the black Republican senator from South Carolina, has been chosen to give the official Republican rebuttal, as is tradition after the president gives an address to Congress. The problems at the southern border continue unabated, with President Biden finally admitting to it being a crisis. Former President George W. Bush gave an interview with CBS Sunday Morning, encouraging Congress to tamp down the rhetoric demonizing immigrants, hoping it could lead to more respect and reform. The White House is planning to order federal agencies to cease using terms like alien, illegal, and assimilation when talking about immigrants, as detailed in memos heading to ICE and CBP, reversing a Trump policy that didn't care less how it was describing immigrants, even if it was in the most derogatory term. NASA created history this week with the first flight to take part on Mars. After a helicopter named Ingenuity lifted off the ground for 10 feet for 39 seconds, it still caused history. The agency's Mars rover Perseverance also succeeded in creating oxygen on the red planet by converting carbon dioxide into the molecule we all need to breathe in. Perseverance made enough oxygen to sustain an astronaut for 10 minutes, which isn't nothing. Soon we'll all live on Mars. The Elon Musk-owned rocket company SpaceX also launched 4 astronauts into orbit for the International Space Station on Friday, the first time a pre-used capsule and rocket were utilized for launch. Before the House passed a bill this week that endorsed accepting Washington, D.C. as the nation's 51st state a second time, the White House also released a formal statement endorsing the effort, saying that statehood would give residents, quote, long overdue full representation. D.C. has a delegate in Congress, is taxed, but doesn't have an official voting member in Congress that can vote on any of the bills. After Derek Chauvin was convicted in Minnesota, as we discuss a bit later, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, announced an investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department's policing practices, saying that minorities receive disproportionately harsher treatment in a way that violates their civil rights under the U.S. Constitution. As we detail a bit later, Biden announced the U.S. will cut emissions targets in half by 2030 and dropped a federal challenge against California's auto emission standards. Trump tried challenging Cali's car emission standards, saying they were too costly to consumers and that the state didn't have the authority to do it anyway, but Biden wants to continue Obama rules that set higher standards to combat climate change. For the first time, an Air Force general faces a court-martial. Major General William Cooley is being court-martialed on sexual assault allegations, saying he made numerous unwanted advances to a woman. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the talks about the Iranian nuclear deal were constructive even after the country's supreme leader said it wasn't worth it. Indirect talks took place in Vienna last week, trying to get the U.S. and Iran back to the table together after Trump took the U.S. out of the deal and instilled sanctions. The talks advanced as the Biden administration formally offered its openness to ease sanctions against Iran's economy, according to sources familiar with the talks. The U.S. and China agreed to take action against climate change together, even though the two countries are fighting each other about a raft of human rights and geopolitical issues. Climate envoy John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart announced the move, with Biden having invited 40 world leaders for a two-day climate summit for Earth Day. The White House announced that it plans to cut American emissions by at least half by 2030 ahead of the summit, almost double the commitment made at the Paris Climate Agreement, which Trump backed the U.S. out of. The summit wasn't without its fair share of technological hiccups and glitches, but it succeeded in communicating to the world that the U.S. was recommitting to fighting climate change, despite other countries being a little bit doubtful that another president in 4 years won't just back out of the commitments made this year.
The signs are unmistakable. The science is undeniable. But the cost of inaction keeps mounting. The United States sets out on the road to cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade. That's where we're headed as a nation. And that's what we can do if we take action to build an economy that's not only more prosperous, but healthier, fair, and cleaner for the entire planet. You know, these steps will set America on a path of net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050. But the truth is, America represents less than 15% of the world's emissions. No nation can solve this crisis on our own, as I know you all fully understand. All of us, and particularly those of us who represent the world's largest economies, we have to step up.
South Korea announced that it's exploring a vaccine swap with the U.S., with America loaning out extra vaccines in exchange for South Korea returning the same amount of vaccines later. South Korean President Moon Jae-in also said this week that Trump was beating around the bush with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, pointing to Biden's opportunity to salvage a denuclearization deal with North Korea. Secretary of State Blinken imposed visa restrictions against Ugandan leaders who are purportedly responsible for harassing opposition figures in the African nation and using security forces to intimidate voters. Following American-imposed sanctions against Russia for hacks and election interference, Putin returned the favor in kind, kicking out American diplomats, including advising the American ambassador John Sullivan to return to the U.S. After Sullivan originally said he was going to stay in Russia, thank you very much, it turns out Sullivan will in fact return to the U.S. In the meantime, Russian troops continue to amass on the border with Ukraine, enough for a potential invasion, and imprisoned opposition figure Alexei Navalny was transferred to a hospital after he started a hunger strike protesting how his prison treated his medical condition. Later in the week, Putin reportedly ordered troops to withdraw from the border, and Navalny called off his hunger strike. Biden is preparing to formally recognize the Armenian genocide, which took place in 1915 against Armenians at the hands of Ottoman Turks, back when the Ottoman Empire was a thing. Turkey, having replaced the Ottoman Empire, refuses to say the genocide was real, with its official position that a genocide never took place against the Armenians, as the conflict at the time killed many other groups of people and completely ignoring the organized effort to get rid of Armenians. Other countries are wary of formally recognizing the Armenian genocide because of Turkey's political power. The White House announced that Biden is going to take his first foreign trips as president in June to attend the G7 and NATO summits in the UK and Brussels, respectively. Although not a foreign trip, Biden also plans on visiting the state of Georgia at the end of this month to celebrate his first 100 days as president, as thanks for the state largely getting him into the White House. When former President Trump used White House Secret Service and the nation's military to clear Lafayette Square in front of the White House to take a picture with a Bible in front of a church, questions were raised about whether there were any laws broken and how law enforcement was used. The Washington Post reported that the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General Joseph Kufari refused to investigate specifically the Secret Service's role in clearing out Lafayette Square. Kufari also refused to look into the COVID outbreak within the Secret Service's ranks, excusing both investigations by saying that his office's resources were limited to launch investigations into those areas. A separate Inspector General report released by the Housing and Urban Development Inspector General Ray Oliver Davis found that so-called bureaucratic obstacles prevented then-Secretary Ben Carson from delivering aid to Puerto Rico after the devastation wrought by Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, including requiring an interagency review process to release congressionally approved grants and then obstructing a congressional investigation looking into why the funds weren't sent out. Over in Congress, a medical examiner officially ruled the late Capitol Police officer Brian Sicknick, who died a day after being assaulted at the January 6th insurrection of Trump supporters attempting to stop Biden's Electoral College certification, died from natural causes brought about from a series of strokes. 2 men were arrested for assaulting Sicknick with a chemical spray. Meanwhile, a new report released this week by the nonprofit group Advanced Democracy, coupled with a review from NBC, showed that the FBI had more advance notice of Trump supporters planning to ransack the Capitol, despite saying publicly they didn't have credible evidence of future rioting. The report showed that there were hundreds of posts on social media with people talking about how they plan to stampede over Capitol Police to invade the Capitol building as Congress was certifying Biden's presidential victory. After not having too much luck compromising with Republicans on a 9/11-like fact-finding commission about what happened on the day of the insurrection, House Speaker Pelosi offered a new plan to evenly split the commission between Democrats and Republicans after an earlier plan giving a majority to Democrats was shot down. Many Democrats were uncomfortable serving on the commission with Republicans who were directly supporting Trump supporters protesting Biden's Electoral College victory on January 6th. Over at the House, after Congresswoman Maxine Waters made waves with her comments for protesters to become more confrontational in the streets if former police officer Derek Chauvin wasn't convicted of George Floyd's murder, Republicans snatched on the comments, calling Waters divisive and violent. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said that he was going to draft censure resolutions against her, with Waters defending her statements as nonviolent and saying she won't back down from Republican bullying. After introducing the censure against Waters, Republicans were denied their chance to make Waters a bigger political issue when Democrats shot down the censure. House Speaker Pelosi said that Waters had nothing to apologize for. Ohio Republican Congressman Steve Stivers announced his resignation from the House starting May 16th. He accepted an offer to become the president and CEO of the Ohio Chamber of Commerce. Continuing our Congress Insider Trading series, Insider reported how Congress Mary Newman and her husband started filling their stock portfolio with vaccine makers and other companies that increased operations due to the pandemic, with a spokesman for the Congresswoman's office saying that the stocks are diversified so there's nothing to worry about. The House approved a bill to officially allow D.C. to become the 51st state in the U.S. by a 216 to 208 vote, the second time the House voted to adopt D.C. as a state. Currently, D.C. residents don't have a Congress member representing them despite paying federal taxes. The measure doesn't seem to have a future in the Senate, which requires more than 60 votes to get past the filibuster. Republicans are against D.C. statehood for reasons ranging from it just increasing the number of Democratic seats in the House and Senate to the Founding Fathers ostensibly not intending to allow D.C. to become a state. A bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans called the Problem Solvers Caucus endorsed increasing the gas tax for the first time since 1993 as one way to fund Biden's infrastructure proposal. The tax currently stands at 18.4 cents a gallon. Over at the Senate confirmed that a 98-2 vote Biden's nominee to be Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco. Biden's number 3 pick for the Department of Justice, however, Vanita Gupta, had a harder time getting the job on a 50-49 vote, with Republicans' opposition coalescing over the disdain over Gupta's leadership of the DOJ Civil Rights Division under Obama. In the midst of internal debates about Biden's infrastructure plan and how it would affect Republican districts, Senate Republicans agreed to keep a symbolic ban on earmarks, the congressional practice to allocate taxpayer money to pet projects back at a congressman's district. The practice used to be popular for the pork it can bring back to someone's district, but was seen as corruption by Republicans who agreed to ban the practice during Obama's presidency, arguably making it more difficult to compromise on major initiatives. The catch here, though, is that the ban isn't enforceable, so earmarks might still be making a return in an infrastructure package. Senate Republicans released their counter-proposal to Biden's infrastructure plan, costing way less than the originally reported $800 billion price tag, coming out to $568 billion. Biden's plan, comparably, is $2.3 trillion. The Republican proposal narrowly defines what is included when it comes to infrastructure, leaving out parts of Biden's plan that he calls human infrastructure, which includes improving nursing homes and childcare so that women can participate more in the workforce and investing in education. Republicans didn't detail how they were going to pay for all of their plan, decrying and rejecting Biden's plan to increase corporate taxes to 28%, up from 21% Trump adopted when he was in office. Biden faces hurdles within his own party, however, as moderates like Joe Manchin want a tax rate of 25%. Biden plans on meeting more Republican lawmakers to hammer out a compromise with the target of a bill passing in July, possibly after July 4th. The bill that was set up to test the Republicans' use of the filibuster passed on Thursday. The Senate passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which primarily focused on anti-Asian hate crimes, which, according to a California State University study, shot up by 149% last year, with public officials like President Trump naming COVID the China virus. The bill would empower the Justice Department to expedite hate crimes investigations, reach out to the public about reporting hate crimes, and create a centralized reporting system for such crimes. The filibuster wasn't used after a deal was struck between Democrats and Republicans, which would allow Republicans to pitch amendments to the bills dealing with reporting hate crime statistics during the pandemic, to removing federal funding from schools that discriminated against Asians in the admissions process, to investigating whether COVID restrictions violated religious organizations' First Amendment rights. Ultimately, the bill passed 94-1, with only Republican Josh Hawley voting no, and the bill goes to the House. Over at the federal judiciary, a study conducted by the North Carolina Law Review found that after reviewing references to the news media and Supreme Court opinions since 1784, there is a general disdain for the news media along with negative illustrations of the press. The Biden administration is set to argue against immigrants seeking green cards after receiving an immigration temporary status called TPS, which was granted to groups such as El Salvadorians and a dozen other countries. Immigration advocates are disappointed with the administration's choice, while Biden administration lawyers say that the wording of the statute governing the issue is clear and they can't argue against it, as TPS recipients were never technically, quote, admitted into the country. The White House announced that it was increasing the seasonal worker visa cap by 22,000, with 6,000 visas specifically reserved for migrants coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. A report by the Washington Post reviewing internal data from the Health and Human Services Department showed that migrant children that came to the U.S. without an accompanying adult are spending an average of 25 days in government custody, even though there are parents already in the country eager to take them in, with the government saying it's moving as fast as possible with reunifications. The Supreme Court dismissed a number of challenges at the start of the week, with dismay coming from Republicans. First, the High Court got rid of a case challenging 2020 election results from Pennsylvania, continuing a trend to not waste their time entertaining lies of election fraud from former President Trump and his allies. A Second Amendment case revolving around lifetime gun ownership bans was dismissed also, letting lower court rulings stand, whereby people who had been convicted of DUIs, false tax return statements, and selling counterfeit tapes from owning firearms. Finally, a case about a Kentucky man's seized pickup truck at the Mexican border was dismissed after Gerardo Serrano sued the federal government for taking his truck for 2 years since law enforcement found 5 bullets in his car at a border crossing with Mexico. The Supreme Court did take a case looking into whether certain rules of evidence override a criminal defendant's Sixth Amendment right to cross-examine witnesses. For all of the lawyers still awake for this part of our coverage, the case Hemphill v. New York concerns whether the Sixth Amendment lets the defendant give responsive evidence against hearsay admissions. Normally, someone wouldn't be able to give responsive evidence against hearsay, but the criminal defendant, quote, opened the door to certain types of evidence to be admissible when he tried pinning his crime on someone else. The High Court ruled this week that Social Security recipients can challenge the authority of the administrative judge's ruling over their case, reversing a ban against the practice as a violation of the 10th Amendment, which gives states power over anything not outlined in the federal Constitution, and the 8th Amendment right against excessive bails, fines, or cruel and unusual punishment. Without being able to question the judge's authority, the Social Security benefit claimants didn't have any other relief. The High Court also decided a case dealing with the Federal Trade Commission's powers to recover money from fraudulent companies and give that money back to the swindled party. After reviewing the FTC statutory authority handed down by Congress, the court unanimously ruled that Congress did not give the FTC the power to recover money consumers lost from fraudsters, which isn't a good look. The ruling forces the FTC to go through a slower administrative process that would have those who got cheated out of their money to wait forever, possibly without ever financially recovering. And finally, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to reject limits on life sentences without parole for juveniles, revolving around a case where a then 15-year-old Brett Jones killed his grandfather. Jones' lawyers tried invoking the 8th Amendment to argue against Mississippi's determination that Jones was, quote, permanently incorrigible, meaning he couldn't be rehabilitated, but the conservative justices of the court weren't swayed by that argument, saying that the court precedent doesn't allow for the striking of such a state determination, despite the court having struck down the death penalty and life without parole sentences for murder before. The New York Attorney General Letitia James argued in a filing before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals to uphold a rent stabilization law challenging an appeal filed by landlords who want the law gone. A Brooklyn federal judge dismissed the landlord's challenge, who were saying the state's rent stabilization laws constituted a taking under the Fifth Amendment, which requires the government to pay someone when their property is taken under eminent domain. A failed New York City subway bomber who tried to set off his suicide vest in the underground J Street Metrotech station in 2017 was sentenced to life in prison on Thursday. Akayarullah tried blowing himself up in the name of ISIS, but only ended up having his request for mercy rejected by federal Judge Richard Sullivan of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Over in national news, following the rise of COVID cases in Michigan, Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer said she wouldn't put new restrictions in place, a far cry from her position in the beginning of the pandemic, which led Republicans to despise her, including launching protests at the state capitol, as well as law enforcement foiling a plot from far-right radical groups to kidnap Whitmer. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the Republican legislature sued the governor, causing much of her restrictions to be rolled back. As Johnson & Johnson waited for American regulators to clear their vaccine after a pause stemming from blood clots, European regulators cleared their vaccines beforehand, slapping a warning label pointing out the very rare risk of blood clots. In other news, Pfizer identified fake vaccine doses being administered in Mexico and Poland, warning people to look out for fake offers to pay close to $1,000 for shots filled with distilled water or anti-wrinkle cream. A study published in the journal Nature Communications found that those who are at least 50 years old would be 30% more likely to develop dementia in their late 70s if they sleep 6 hours or less every night. 2 separate mass shootings at Texas and Wisconsin left 6 people dead on Sunday. A former sheriff's deputy killed his wife Amanda, daughter Alyssa, and 18-year-old Willie Simmons at a scheduled custody visit in Austin. The shooter was apprehended later in the day, and a clear motive wasn't determined. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, a shooter killed 3 people at a busy tavern after he was asked to leave and came back with a gun. The suspect was arrested and charged with murder. The trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin for the killing of George Floyd came to an end after the prosecution and defense gave their closing arguments. The jury started deliberating on Monday, with the judge warning them not to tune into recent officer-involved shootings of black Americans, including the recent utterances by Congresswoman Maxine Waters encouraging protesters to become more confrontational if Chauvin wasn't convicted. Before the jury delivered its verdict, President Biden phoned George Floyd's family, saying he will pray with them, and separately saying that he was praying for a conviction, pointing to the, quote, overwhelming evidence.
I've come to know George's family, not just in passing. I've spent time with him. I spent time with his little daughter, Gianna. You should see this beautiful child. And his brother, both brothers, as a matter of fact. I can only imagine the pressure and anxiety they're feeling. And so I waited till the jury was sequestered, and I called. And as I wasn't going to say anything about it, but Lonius said today on television, and he accurately said it was a private conversation because Joe understands what it's like to go through loss. And they're a good family, and they're calling for peace and tranquility, no matter what that verdict is. I'm praying the verdict is the right verdict, which is, I think it's overwhelming in my view. I wouldn't say that unless the jury was sequestered now, not hear me say that. But so we just talked to, I want to know how they were doing, just personally, and we talked about personal things.
Biden further stated he avoided saying anything until the jury was sequestered, as it was at the time. After only 10.5 hours, the jury came back delivering 3 guilty verdicts on all of the charges against Chauvin, ending a day of anxiety for black Americans, hoping this could be the start of a trend of holding police officers accountable.
Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court File Number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, Juror Foreperson, Juror Number 19. Same caption, Verdict Count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by Jury Foreperson, Juror Number 19. Same caption, Verdict Count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury Foreperson 019.
Chauvin now has to be sentenced to prison in a separate hearing, with a maximum of 40 years arising from his conviction. After the conviction, Biden said that the verdict was a step forward for the nation, reflecting an occurrence much too rare. A USA Today poll found that 71% of Americans agreed Chauvin was guilty. A Washington Post ABC poll also found that 60% of Americans think the country should do more to hold police to account for the mistreatment of black people, being less concerned with how accountability measures can get in the way of how law enforcement practices policing. Not even 10 minutes before the verdict was read in the Chauvin case, Columbus, Ohio police shot a 16-year-old black girl by the name of Ma'Khia Bryant. Bryant apparently called the police for help, saying a group of girls came to her house to attack her, while a member of the group called the police as well, saying someone with a knife was trying to attack them. The result of the encounter was a police officer arriving onto the scene, with Bryant swinging the knife at somebody, at which point the officer shot Bryant, according to body cam footage released shortly. An investigation into the incident is underway. The White House Press Secretary Jem Psaki called the shooting tragic, further saying the president was briefed on the situation. The union that lost its effort to organize at an Amazon warehouse in Alabama appealed the vote loss, claiming Amazon violated labor laws prohibiting unfair interference in the organizing election. The loss was a blowout after potential union members tried being an example for other Amazon workers. The challenges revolve around mandatory meetings held by Amazon leadership arguing against unionizing, controlling a traffic signal, preventing union organizers from talking to workers, and more. Walter Mondale, who was former President Jimmy Carter's vice president and the presidential nominee against Ronald Reagan in 1984 before experiencing one of the biggest blowouts in history, died this week at the age of 93. Mondale was a hero to many liberals and served 12 years in the Senate before becoming Carter's VP. A New York Times investigation found that just only around a dozen donors are responsible for making up $1 out of every $13 raised in political donations since 2009, totaling around $3.4 billion, underscoring the power and influence mega donors have since the Citizens United decision. The former patriarch and now second matriarch of the Kardashian clan, Caitlyn Jenner, announced that she is going to challenge Democratic California Governor Gavin Newsom for his seat in this recall election. That's it for this week's show at the 25th hour, hoping you stay on top of the 24/7 news cycle. Don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts, share us with your friends, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can email your tips and suggestions at the 25thhournews@gmail.com and become a patron today for as low as $2 a month to support the show at patreon.com/the 25th hour news. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.